Those of you that don't know me, my name's Timothy Muffitt. I'm the music director of the Lansing Symphony, and we have a very exciting concert coming up this weekend on Saturday night at the Wharton Center. And we're going to kick things off with a fairly new work by Sarah Gibson, who you see on the screen there, and the one waving, she's the composer. And I can tell you that that I am very excited to get started on this work. The orchestra begins rehearsal on Wednesday, and I have been uh, in the weeds in this piece of music, and it's all bouncing around inside my head, but I can't wait to hear an actual orchestra play it. That's always an exciting moment for the conductor, and Sarah, I know it's an exciting moment for the composer too. So with that, I'll say welcome. It's good to have you here with us, here in
Thank you so
Lansing,
much for
Michigan.
having me.
You bet. We just want to get to know you a little bit. And I know that you are in California now, but just give us a little background. Where did you grow up and what brought you to this place where you are now?
Yeah, so I grew up outside of Atlanta, Georgia, and I was trained as a classically trained pianist from as like a 7-year-old. So as a 4-year-old, I was begging my parents to take piano lessons, and they made me wait till I was 7. We just had like a little rickety upright piano in our basement, and I was always going to it and trying to pick out stuff and play around and do things like that. My mother is a painter, and so arts and crafts were always a part of my life as a childhood, and creativity was very much a part of my life as a childhood. So it was, it was a very safe space to just kind of have arts and crafts around that little rickety piano, and to be able to create my own little things as I was growing up. So I was really fortunate when I was 7 that my piano teacher realized that when I was playing, if I made a mistake, I'd get more excited about the mistake than I would about the music that I was playing, and I'd go off and make up my own little thing. And so she told my parents that whenever they heard me practicing something that I wasn't supposed to be practicing, it was probably because I was making it up. And so I had a tape recorder beside my piano, and my mom would just go over and press record. And then we'd take that little tape into my piano teacher, and she'd help me write it down. So that was a really wonderful thing to have as a young child, a teacher that picked that up, because not all teachers can pick that up. And so,
Right.
yeah, sorry.
I just said that's a great story. I love that.
Yeah, it was really, I was very fortunate. So yeah, I just kept kind of writing. There was this creativity program through the National PTA called Reflections that had like photography and visual art and writing and then composing. And so every year I would write a piece for this little competition that my school would put on. And so that kept me writing from a young age. And I think I just always knew, I think, if you asked me when I was 7 what I wanted to do, I would have said write music for Disney movies. So, not too far from that, I suppose. So yeah, from there, I did my undergraduate at Indiana University in Bloomington, where I was a composition and piano double major. And so, piano has very much stayed a part of my life. I'm a very active pianist. I have a new music piano duo called Hocket, that we commission new works and play new works all the time. And I always kind of say that the Venn diagram of piano and composition is really just a circle for me, because they just feed each other so much. And then after Indiana, I came out to USC in Los Angeles. And then I stayed here for my master's and my doctorate, and have just been doing my thing.
Wonderful. Well, we're glad that the Lansing Symphony came into your Venn diagram, and
Yes,
that
yes,
we had that
definitely.
intersection. So you've been writing music since you were 7 or whatever,
Mhm.
and How has the composition process changed? I mean, are there any remnants from that early thing that you still do today, or what's it like when you sit down to write a piece of music?
Yeah, I think there is still very much a part of that, especially through my piano duo, because we play so much new music. I'm constantly thinking, what what do I like about this? What would be stronger about this? How would I achieve this? What would I do differently? So not that I'm like going after mistakes necessarily that I was making, but that I'm always asking myself questions about the music that I'm playing. And that's making me think about, like, if I were to try a technique like this, how would I approach it? And so I think that sort of like curiosity in other music and what's going on, I think is very much a part of my process. Piano is also very much a part of my process. I go to my piano, and I think my music is very melodically based. And so very often I come up with a melody first, and then I, try to harmonize it, or I record myself. Very often I'll use the voice memo app on my phone, and I'll just press record, and I'll just kind of improvise on something, and then later I'll transcribe what I like of that and that sort of thing. I also sing a lot when I am at the beginning of a piece, or even in the middle and end of a piece. And I use the voice memo app for that too. Living in Los Angeles, I'm in the car a lot.
Right.
So I'm, driving around town. And so it's easy for me to just like kind of vamp and, improvise on singing while I'm driving, and just record it. And then when I get home, listen back to it and see if there was anything in there that stuck.
Wow. So many composers that you and I and probably many of our friends here today, they would keep a notebook in their pocket. When they get an idea, they would write it down, but you've got your voice memo on your iPhone.
Right,
And
right.
that's the 21st century compositional notebook. Wow.
You do see though that I do have staff paper here,
Oh,
so
I do. Yes,
I
right.
do still write stuff, do handwritten stuff.
Right. Yeah, well, somehow it has to get from the phone onto a piece of paper, right? So
Right,
that's where that
exactly,
comes into place.
exactly. Yeah.
So just to follow up a little bit more on the composition process, I was looking at your catalog, and you don't write sonatas, and you don't write symphonies, and you write pieces with really exotic, evocative titles. I'm just going to share some of these, and then I'm going to ask you to tell us what that says to us about you in terms of your compositional process. Here's just a
Sure.
few of my favorites. Sea Monkey, it's a good one. Follow the Crumbs Out of the Woods. Another favorite, Sure Baby, Manana. So are these titles, I'll just let you talk about that. How do those titles work into the way the piece actually sounds?
Right. Yeah. So I will start with titles used to be my least favorite thing about writing music. It was really hard for me to come up with a title.
Mhm.
I would write the piece first, and then I would find a title later or something like that. But my husband is a writer, and so and he always, when he's writing, he starts with the title and then goes into his creative process. And I think that sort of influenced me. I've thought more about titles earlier on as I've, gone down my path. But there's many different ways that I come about with titles. So many of my pieces are inspired by visual art. And it's a lot of times what I'll do when I go to an art museum is, let's say that I find a piece of art that I'm drawn to and that maybe I'm inspired by. I take a picture of the little description of the piece of art and that's next to it. And very often I can find quotes or phrases in that description that I use. So for instance, one title that you didn't mention, but I prefer living in color, comes from one of those little captions where it was a David Hockney quote. And so I like finding kind of these extra musical ways that the art or what I'm inspired by is influencing the work. And then let's see, the other way is through poetry. So, well, and actually, Sure Baby Manana, the title that you did bring up, that comes straight from a piece of artwork by Ed Ruscha, who's a California artist, and he does these kind of stark paintings that very often have text over them, and Sure Baby Manana was one of the phrases over it, and I just loved the kind of like swag that phrase had. And then another way that I find titles is through poetry. So for instance, To Make This Mountain Taller, the piece that you'll be premiering this week, that comes from a poem. And so I think that it's, exciting to me to find extra musical ways that poetry or artwork or nature or things like that influence my music. And then very often I can kind of weave in and find something poetic that becomes a title for my pieces, so that that helps me with that aspect.
Very interesting. And there is also a visual art component to Make This Mountain Taller,
Yes.
too, that I'm sure you'll tell us about in just a little bit. So I want to back up a little. This is all really interesting. You have a unique path, it sounds like, and just to again kind of to understand your origin story a little bit. So in other words, many composers, I think, hear a piece of music and then that inspires them to go into composition. That came totally from inside you. So who were some of the early composers that you noticed and felt that resonated for you? Like when you really got serious about composition, but maybe before you had taken sophomore music history, right? So somewhere in that gray area where you really started to form as a creative artist, who were those composers that you kind of raised your eyebrow and made you sit up and take notice?
I think that's a great question. As a young student, like when I was in high school, I always say I think every high school musician goes through their Shostakovich phase where they just think that it's like, the most rockingest music in the world. I was really fortunate. The Atlanta Youth Symphony is a really great youth symphony. And I got to play piano with the Atlanta Youth Symphony. And so that put me in the orchestra from, like 10th grade through 12th grade. I was just like smack dab in the middle of the orchestra whenever I was playing, these 20th century works. And so I think that Shostakovich and Prokofiev, the Russians, really inspired me when I was in high school because they were just so visceral and so emotional and so forward with what they wanted to say. And so they really excited me when I was that young. Once I got into college, I think that one of the first composers that really, really stuck out to me was Messiaen, because he was one of the composers that I think I first recognized that no matter where you were listening to one of his pieces, if you dropped a needle, you knew it was him. And so he has such a specific voice, and it's just sort of undeniable when you're listening to him that really struck me. And so I don't know, I don't think my music sounds like Messiaen per se, but I think that I just really was inspired by how specific his voice was. And then as I got older, I think also Witold Lutoslawski was another composer that really stuck out to me as one that again has a specific voice. But what I really love about him is that he pushed himself throughout his career to change his voice. So he really transforms what he's saying and really goes for different things as he goes through his career. So those composers are probably, the ones that really stuck out to me the most. Also, I had French piano teachers. So My Ravel is another composer that really, speaks to my heart.
Sure. Well, I do want to just say that I feel like you have a unique and original voice in your music here. Whenever we talk about early influences, it's easy to say, "Oh yeah, I hear a little bit." I don't hear. I just hear someone I've never heard before in this,
Thank you.
uh, and I think there's been a shift in this century of especially American composers, and a shift in style that, even though many, and I mean, I've looked at a lot of music of living American composers, and there's a thread that I can't really put my handle on, put my finger on, I should say, um, but that really is speaking to audiences in ways that perhaps composers of the mid 20th century left audiences bewildered.
Mm,
And I feel like you and others of your generation have found a way to be uncompromisingly modern, but yet relatable.
mm,
And which, I don't know if that's a conscious thing or if it's just something that has spun out of the process.
mm.
But audiences are happy. And we did an audience survey just not too long ago, and I was so thrilled at how much enthusiasm there was for new music
Oh, that's great.
from them. And that was not the response you would have gotten in 1970.
Right.
So here's a thank you on behalf of our audiences to people such as yourself who I don't know, maybe audiences have come a long way, maybe we're meeting in the middle. And again, none of this is to say that it's in any way diluted. It's uncompromisingly powerful, important music, but there's something new out there. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I think that's a really astute comment. I think that composers, I've noticed, are just more unabashedly being themselves. They aren't trying to, like if you think about like the early 20th century, like everybody doing serialism or something like that, and that they're all trying to say the same thing. They're all trying to do the thing. They're all trying to, do the right thing and show I'm a studious composer and I can do this technique. And I think that now it's more individual. I think that there's more acceptance of different backgrounds and what different influences can be from where the composers are coming from. And I also think there's more narrative perhaps involved, or maybe I should say more personal narrative involved. So, whereas Ravel might write something, that about like Laval's has a narrative, but it's not necessarily about his life, right? And so I think that, composers today are finding personal experience to put into their music. And I think that that just innately speaks more to audiences. I think that, that shows more personal relationships that people can build with the music, and they can find their way into the music more. So I think that's part of it. And I think that, again, just like the composer not worrying as much about if they're checking all the boxes. I mean, of course, every composer has their neuroses about, am I doing the right thing? Am I, is this going to be smart enough? Is this going to be cool enough? Is this going to be a statement? That sort of thing. But I think that it is more accepting. I think there is a more accepting audience right now, and a more curious audience about what the composer wants to say.
Right. And I wonder too, like I said, I don't think this has been a one-way street where composers have just moved in one direction. I feel like audiences were coming together, and there seems to me to be an almost blending of styles, more so than, I mean, it was such a big deal when Gershwin mixed a little jazz into
Right.
music. It's like, whoa, this is mind-blowing. And when William Grant Still had been doing it all along, and many others. But my point is that the mixture was a thing. And now I feel like there's just so many styles that are being mixed together into concert music on stage that that also helps with the relatability. That an audience might, even if it's not something we ever even talk about, it might just be something that shows up, a gesture or a harmony or a progression. And so where I'm going with this, I know that you also do some teaching at Cal State Long Beach, and so you have composition students.
Mm-hmm.
And how are you noticing that generation being different from your own in terms of sources of inspiration and the compositional process? Are they still at the keyboards, or is it all being done on computers? Or what's that looking like with that next generation of composer coming up after you?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I teach at Cal State Long Beach, and then I also teach a high school composition program through the Los Angeles Philharmonic. So I work with a bunch of high schoolers there too. So I work with high schoolers and college students. And I will say, like, definitely there is more computer-based, composition happening. A lot of them use digital audio workstations like, Logic and things like that to create a sound world first and then put it into Sibelius or Finale or whatever notation program they're working in. I do encourage my students still to write by hand some things, because I think it's important to be able to get out of the computer, because there's things like students sometimes can forget that computers don't have to breathe. And, and then if you have them like write it by hand and then sing it, and they go, oh, I haven't breathed for, 3 minutes. And it's like that oboist might pass out by now. So, I think that the computer is definitely influencing this work, but I also think that it's really important that the computer is, influencing them. I think that gives them yet another landscape to work on. It's another program where they can just kind of toss pasta at the wall and see what sticks, which I think is really can be a really creative process for a lot of these students. One of the things that I've noticed the most in my students is that they've really brought political viewpoints into their music. So that's been something that they've been very strongly influenced by. And it's not so much, I think that they think less about genre, and they think less about, what type of music they're writing, and more about what they're saying. And so I think that, narrative, again, is really important to a lot of these young students' works. And I think that they're very proactive with, what they believe in, and they want to be able to say something important that sticks. So that's been really inspiring to see how these students find ways to, be socially aware through the music that they're writing. And that's been really exciting.
Right, that's an interesting trend, and one that has shown up from time to time. I mean, we can go back to even Beethoven and making political statements, and certainly Mozart as well. But what I'm hearing from you is that perhaps these are a little bit more overt, which they could be, because they won't be beheaded.
Right,
or,
exactly.
or in the case of Shostakovich, be hauled off to a labor camp.
Right.
So we do have that freedom in this country to say what we want. So, but what I'm hearing is that, am I understanding that maybe it's a little bit more specific, and that, maybe the title represents something, or it's in response to an event or a happening?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I think that it's very specific, and sometimes it's very specific to their heritage. Sometimes it's very specific to a moment in the news that's happening right now. I think that it just sort of depends on the student.
Right. And do they still play instruments? The
Yes,
composition
they do.
students? Okay.
Yes, they
Because
do.
it is entirely possible to create music on a computer without being able to play a note yourself.
It is, it's really interesting because, like, I think about all the time that every freshman in their dorm is making some sort of beat on their computer, and they're just like creating something and pulling it out of thin air. And it's very, very possible to make music without knowing how to read music, without knowing how to play anything. And I think there's a time and a place for all of it, like there's music production has become a big, popular major, music business, that sort of thing. And having an awareness of at least how to create music, I think helps with that sort of thing. But it is true that I think that, the students that are actually writing for living, breathing instrumentalists, most of them have some sort of instrumental background,
Right.
and play in some way.
I think all of this, what you're describing, is great for the world of music. I mean, any individual who has the opportunity to experience creating a piece of music will then be even more interested in what you're creating or what else is being created out there. And the other thing too is that the distribution of music has changed so dramatically in terms of it's not just one classical radio station in town and a handful of stations playing popular music, but with Spotify and all these other ways to consume music, that there aren't as many tastemakers out
Right.
there.
Right. That's a really, yeah, and that actually is another thing that it just constantly blows me away with my student is like, I'll bring in a piece of music that I hadn't heard of that I'm excited by. And they're like, oh yeah, that came up on my Spotify playlist the other day. And it's like, oh, well, shoot, like how it's sometimes it's hard to bring in something that they haven't heard before because they can just go down rabbit holes on Spotify and YouTube and, Apple Music and whatever they want to do. But, but that also, I think sometimes it can be overwhelming for them, like it can be, they can't parse out what's what, but also it gives them so much to listen to that, I think that it's really a big influence for them. I do like to encourage them to look at scores with pieces, because there's a very big difference between just driving in your car and listening to a piece and then like actually looking at what the composer wrote, and seeing how they do that. So, I encourage them to flag things that they like while they're listening to Spotify or whatever, so that they can try to find a score to look at later.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, and this is how the two media can coexist. We still need our radio stations.
Right.
And we're blessed here in the Lansing area with one of the great classical stations, WKAR, with an artistic crew there that really curates just beautiful, beautiful programming, because we do need curation. It is a rabbit hole, this the streaming media, or the Spotify's and Apple Music's. And how exciting that people do want to go down those rabbit holes, but we still need the curators, which
Right.
I consider us as performing arts organizations as curators too. We still need that, stimulate the interest, and then they can choose their rabbit hole. So I think that's the best of relationships possible.
Right. Right.
Well, let's talk a little bit about to make this mountain taller. I'm going to show everybody what it looks like. This is actually part of the score. These are my scribbles here. I don't know how they got there. I think just slipping them in my briefcase perhaps, but this is the piece. And there's Sarah's name right there, written backwards as you see it. But so here's a piece that ties into actually much of what we've already talked about today in terms of its inspiration. There is a societal event that inspired this. There is poetry that inspired it. There is visual art that inspired it. And your program note is written beautifully in here, but I would love to hear you just talk to us about this piece and
Sure.
All the way from inspiration through to creating the work.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, so whenever I start a piece, I either go to an art museum or I go to a live concert or both. Because those are just my two biggest inspirational pieces. I love seeing live music. I love seeing performers work together and communicate together. I think it's the collaborative pianist in me that likes to see that sort of energy on stage. And then, of course, just sort of the introspective peacefulness of trying to find inspiration in an art museum is really, special to me. So there's this wonderful art museum in Pasadena called the Norton Simon Art Museum that I have a membership to. And it's kind of a small museum, which is nice because it's not very overwhelming. You can go for just a couple hours and still feel like you've gotten a lot out of it. And I was walking around their sculpture garden that they have, and I came upon this sculpture by Aristide Maillol, Maillol, that was very striking to me. It's this massive sculpture of a woman, of a nude woman, and she's kneeling, and her leg is in kind of a mountain shape. Her leg is bent. And then she's got her head in her hands, and she looks very concerned, but then she also has curly hair that's sort of blowing in the wind. So there's some sort of like freedom to the sculpture as well. And I recognized that the name of the sculpture was La Montagne, which means the mountain. And it immediately struck me because I feel like historically, mountainous characteristics are more masculine. And I loved that Maillot gave this quality to the feminine. And I was thinking about, the strength that was in the sculpture. And I was thinking about other things. And then it just happened to be the day that I was at the art museum was the day that Roe v. Wade was overturned. And so I was thinking very much about how many mountains women have had to climb to get basic human rights, and how much women have had to fight, to vote and to, get maternity leave and to, have anything like to get basic jobs. And so I was very drawn to this contrast between the strength of the sculpture and also the femininity of the sculpture. And so I was really inspired by this. And I went home and I just kind of started Googling. I was curious if I could find any poetry that talked about mountains from the female perspective, because I thought that this was a unique thing. And I came upon this poem by Rupi Kaur, who's an Indian American poet, that I can't recite the poem from heart by now, but there's the title, "To Make This Mountain Taller," comes from this poem. And essentially the poem is about lifting other women up so that we can go further, and that there's still a lot of work to do. And so I loved that there was, first of all, this kind of communal aspect of women being there for women and, supporting each other. And then I also loved that it was a poem that remarked on how many problems there are, but also how it was positively looking forward to what we can do to keep moving forward. And this all just sort of came, something about the commission, for those of you that don't know, the Toulmin Foundation supports women empowerment. And this whole commission with the League of American Orchestras and ACO is they commissioned 6 different female composers, and each woman writes a different orchestral piece, and then each piece gets played 5 times. And so finding a way to, this to me absolutely represented women supporting other women. And so, finding a way to celebrate what this commission was after just felt right as well. So that's really where I got started with the piece.
Right. Well, I want to mention, I'm going to ask you a specific question about the work.
Please.
But I want to tell our audience today that I'm going to open it up for them to have questions, so they can be thinking now about what they might want to ask you with this great opportunity to interact with you here. So I'm at the point in my career where I'm not afraid to ask dumb questions. Um, but I wish I wouldn't have scribbled on here, but you can see there's clearly a mountain, right? Okay, we have a mountain on the score, a very minimalist mountain. And then we come into, well, first, let me ask you, you use a special technique. You mentioned Messiaen earlier, and you use a very special technique that for a desired effect, which I find really compelling. So before I show our audience this gesture on paper, will you describe what I'm talking about?
Yes, absolutely. So I did steal a technique that Messiaen used first in his piece From the Canyons to the Stars, where the horns can do this really, I'm not a horn player, so I can't go into the scientifics of it specifically, but the horns can press their valves halfway rather than the full way. And then when they blow into the instrument, they can get these really high partials in their instrument that end up sounding like a coyote. So it'll go like, oh, and it sounds sort of extraterrestrial. You don't really know. It's this fascinating sound that no other instrument can make. And it really, I think that it really takes you into this different world. And my idea of using this technique at the beginning was sort of like you're at the bottom of the mountain and you're hearing these coyotes in the area, and and you're about to traverse to try to get to the top of the mountain to, go over these long journeys that we've had to go through.
Interesting. And also how interesting that was a work that he was writing about canyons.
Yes.
So we have this big geological element. Now, maybe, I don't know if you know where I'm going with this question,
Go for it.
but here's for those of us, I don't know, I hope you can see that. Yeah, you can see that.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
What does that look like to me?
Looks like mountains.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's my dumb question for the day. Is that just a coincidence or is that part of it?
I love that you brought it up, because it's something that I didn't think about when I was using it. I just, was trying, honestly, I was probably so distracted about how to make the graphic and the computer program. But then later I did love the way it looked sort of artistic, on the first page. And I think that it shows, it looks like a landscape design. So I think I came up with the sound first. I wasn't thinking about how it would look on the page first. So the sound came first, the landscape came first. And then afterwards, it was kind of like, oh, cool. That looks like, it could be like a drawing of a mountain or something like that.
Well, to the performer, myself here and my colleagues, it's really evocative. And I mean, especially to see it on the front page of a piece called To Make This Mountain Taller. And then that you mentioned that this technique comes from Messiaen's work about canyons. And it just really kind of and I know this is not a piece about mountains, but directly, just metaphorically, but it definitely has an impact on that right there on the front page, and I think sets the tone nicely. So
thank you.
Wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I'm going to open it up to anyone on the call here today. If anyone has any questions for you, I'm not sure how we do that, though. I'm not in charge here. I'm just the hired help. And maybe we can, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat and we can get it from there. So how many, I don't know where we are on the list while people are thinking about doing that. Have you heard the piece? Have you heard it?
Yes, I have. You're the fourth orchestra to perform it, which is great. So Sarasota Orchestra premiered it last March. And then Pittsburgh Symphony played it in October. And then Knoxville Symphony just played it last month.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Well, what a wonderful project. I mean, as you know, as a composer, so many times the work gets premiered and then we move on to the next premiere. And
Right.
it's these multiple performances that give a piece legs and really kind of get it up and going. So
Right. I mean, it's a real dream. It's the first performance is hard to get, the second performance is harder to get,
right.
and so it's so to have a piece have a life, has really been something. And for instance, I've edited the piece since the premiere. It's given me time to fix some things because there's so many things that live in my head, and then you hear them in person. It's like, oh, that didn't quite sound exactly the way that I expected, or they need dynamic changes, sometimes little subtle adjustments or things like that. So yeah, it's been a real honor to be able to live with the piece and to see it go through a few different cycles.
I'll bet. Well,
Yeah,
we are very excited to take it on here and very excited to share it with our audience. And we really appreciate you taking some time to spend with us today and give us a chance to get to know you a little bit before we hear your
absolutely.
music. I don't see any questions coming in the chat, so that tells me that we were very thorough in our presentation and left no stones unturned.
Sounds good.
Great. So with that, I will say thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. Thank you to all of you who tuned in for this discussion. We appreciate the opportunity to have this dialogue and share our enthusiasm for this. So have a wonderful day, everyone, and thanks again, Sarah.
Thank you so much.